I'm Mike Ward, and welcome to Conversations in Healthcare, a video series brought to you by DRG, part of Clarivate. This series examines the healthcare ecosystem and its current challenges and opportunities. In each episode, we'll be talking to key leaders and stakeholders across the industry and that ecosystem, and we'll be sort of talking to them about how they're anticipating and navigating various market dynamics. Currently, our series is focusing on COVID-19 and the challenges that it is actually unleashed on the healthcare industry. This episode is also one of a number that we are recording alongside on Helix, the digital conference that has been hosted by One Nucleus. Okay, I'm delighted to be joined by Baroness Susan Greenfield, who is able to provide insights from a number of different perspectives. Susan is the founder and CEO of a startup, an Oxford-based startup called Neuro-bio, where it's a company that is sort of exploring novel brain mechanisms that are linked to neurodegenerative diseases. She's also a passionate advocate of the public understanding of science and is a member of the UK's upper house of Parliament. So, Susan, how is COVID-19 affecting the work that you're doing at the moment, and what have you done to sort of minimize any impact?
Well, the impact, Mike, has been huge, as you might imagine, because unlike many jobs where people can do things from their desks, of course, if you're running a research lab, you can't socially distance automatically that easily, and you have to go into work. You can't set up a lab in your own house. So as soon as I heard that fateful announcement by Boris Johnson in March, I felt completely devastated, because he says you must stay at home. So within a few days, we have a lab at the Culham Science Centre, and we had to put that into hibernation and sort out what we were going to do. The furlough scheme that the government have introduced has been a godsend, because we're able to put the staff on furlough and keep a skeleton staff working from home in terms of the administration. But where we were very fortunate is, as often happens in science, and especially in the biotech sector, you don't do everything in-house. And this meant that we already had underway some outsourced projects with so-called CROs, Commission Research Organisations. And as it happened, the three companies we were working with were all outside of the UK. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't a bit of nail biting, because one of those companies happened to be in, of all places, Northern Italy. But because they were a medical company, we were hugely relieved, because they were exempted from closure. So that was a bit of a heart stop. The other companies in Portugal, the other ones in Australia, and although they've had variations of lockdown, I think possibly because they're biomedical, they've been able to keep going. So we've been in a position, which is a little bit strange, of sitting on our own hands with the labs completely closed, but at the same time waiting and monitoring and discussing results as they're coming in from other labs. So it hasn't, short answer, it hasn't been too bad. It's not what we would have chosen. It's not ideal, but we're going, we're alive. We're still functioning. We're a company still. And I think if you can say that these days, you should be very grateful.
So, I mean, just sort of give us a sort of an idea of sort of the size of the business.
Yeah.
How many people do you actually have at Culham, and then sort of, the fact you have these sort of partners,
Sure. So
how's it proportionate?
So in-house we have about, it's hard to say because it varies from time to time, because we have interns and visitors, but typically we'd have between 15 and 20 people at Culham, and that includes the very much valued managerial admin staff. And one thing I've learned being in the private sector is that compared to when I was at the university sector, people put a lot of store, investors put a lot of store by having a strong management base. So we have some people who don't go into the lab at all, and they're about a third, perhaps, or a quarter of the workforce. The rest go into the lab. So that's what we have at Culham. And then the companies that we're dealing with are usually quite large companies, because the kinds of work we want them to do require resources and facilities that we don't have. So at the moment, what we're working on are 3 separate projects, each of which is covered by a different company. One is to try and develop a blood biomarker for Alzheimer's, so that even though the degeneration starts in 10 to 20 years before you see the symptoms, even though you haven't got the symptoms, if you had a good blood test, you'd know that the problem was already underway. That's one project. The next is a so-called animal model, because one thing that bedevils Alzheimer's work is there's no authentic animal model that really captures the whole clinical picture. And if that was available, then you could do a lot of testing and experimenting and developing of drugs. And the third is to actually get our own drug, a so-called efficacy study, where we're testing in, again, animal models, whether our patented drug, whether that actually works. So those things which we couldn't do on site have been carrying on at full strength, and we'll know probably by about the end of August what's coming in and how they are. So
those three programs, they're all kind of related, because one is associated with I guess the early diagnosis, etc. The approach you're taking to neurodegenerative diseases is slightly different from others. Could you
very different. It's very different from others. Why we're different is that we ask the very basic question, which no one else has, is why is it that only certain brain cells seem vulnerable to neurodegeneration? We know that you can have a stroke, for example, and you don't automatically get Alzheimer's. So we know there's something special about the cells that initiate the neurodegenerative process that makes them different from all other brain cells. It's not a generic feature of brain cells to embark on neurodegeneration. So where we are different from others is we've characterized the features of the cells that are set apart, the ones that are particularly vulnerable. And we've come up with the idea that neurodegeneration is an inappropriate form of development. Okay, and what we've done is identified the molecule that drives this developmental process that becomes like Jekyll and Hyde. You know, when it's inappropriately activated, it's evil rather than beneficial. And we've identified the target, the so-called receptor, and we have a drug that intercepts it. So we think we're on our way to a very different approach. And this sounds as if I'm doing some kind of Dragon's Den pitch, but why we're special and different is, unlike most approaches, to the best of my knowledge, we actually have a narrative, we actually have a story of why the cells degenerate, because what happens is you'll have some damage, doesn't matter what, blow to the head or a stroke or anything. And if it's the vulnerable cells, they will respond by trying to grow again because they've got this developmental mechanism. But in the context of a mature brain, mechanisms of development can be lethal. So more cells will die. And so therefore it will retaliate by trying to compensate, but more cells will die. And so you'll have this snowball effect. And that's what we call neurodegeneration. We actually can therefore show how that accounts for various clinical facts. And our pride is that we can actually be different from others because we have a story as to why it happens.
And the sort of status of the three programs that you mentioned, where exactly are we in the sort of the timeline?
Okay. So in the timeline, with the biomarker, which is quite hard, as you might imagine, it's easy to conceive. Yes, let's measure the evil molecule in the blood. Easy idea, and anyone could do that, but not everyone can do it. It's very hard, especially with blood, which is a very tricky so-called matrix, to actually be able to single out and detect the molecule of your choice. So we're currently still characterizing an assay that we're developing using antibodies, but we're also partnering with a revolutionary approach, which I won't say too much about because it's under wraps and it's not my company, but we're partnering with them. And they have a machine learning approach, a completely different approach that doesn't involve antibodies. So that's where we are with the biomarker. And if the latter works, then we could make very fast progress. If not, it will be at the stage that these things normally happen, which will take several months to validate and then to get, as we know from the COVID antibody tests and so on, you have to have a high degree of specificity and selectivity and so on. So yes, you might be able to detect it, but you have to be sure you are detecting it, and nothing else. In terms of the efficacy study, we now know that our drug is tolerated with intranasal application, so it would be a nasal spray. And we are waiting, again, biting our nails, to find out if in one of the conventional animal models it works or not. With all the caveats that conventional animal models are not necessarily ideal, then it might be our drugs works, but just not in that model. And then in our own animal model, we know that it does induce behavioral memory impairments, but we've yet to see the histology. So it's such an interesting time. And as I've said to potential investors, now is a very exciting time for Neuro-bio, because we're really just at the uplift, just at the time when, you know, you slog on month after month, as you may know in science, and then you get the chance of the breakthrough or the opposite of that. And that's actually coincided with COVID. So it's quite an interesting time.
I mean, firstly, just on the sort of the public understanding of science, sort of issues, so with all the information that we're sort of seeing, sort of being communicated about the virus, about our, you know, sort of rates of infection, statistical models that keep sort of popping up on the TVs, etc. I just wondered whether, you know, all this information, there would be, you know, this is actually helping the public understanding of science in some sort of way?
I'm not sure. Okay, let me turn the question around. What outcome would we like? You know, if we say we've helped the public understanding of science, what difference would we be seeing? What would be the desired, what would it look like? You know, and I think perhaps we should step back a little bit and say, so what would we like? Do we want all the public to know all the details and to be querying things? And I think that probably at the moment it's not necessarily helping it, because if you asked, how do I see the public understanding of science? It's not so much that they're specialists, but they can understand the basic principles, and they can understand that not everyone agrees. They can understand that you have to weigh up one argument against another. They have to understand that science is always, always, always provisional, depending on the next thing that comes along. And I'm not necessarily sure that those messages are currently being conveyed. And I think people talk about following the science as though it's the Holy Grail, and as though everyone agrees and that it's a single thing. And I think that probably would confuse people or disillusion them when it doesn't deliver, as has been the case. So I think that necessarily the COVID crisis, no one's really applying that to help people understand science clearly, because there's other things to think about and the scientists have got other things to do at the moment. But I think people are probably quite confused by when scientists disagree. They don't quite understand, let's say, what a virus is, possibly. An R number is just a number. What does that mean to anyone for anything? How do they calculate it? So I don't think necessarily that people are any more enlightened than they may have been in March.
Right. And what about the sort of the idea that it might actually inspire children to actually take up science when they kind of realize that, you know, the real superheroes of this whole issue are the people in the healthcare space?
Sure. I think the question I wonder, I would hope that it might inspire people to take up medicine or nursing and to work in the healthcare sector. And I think that probably and the real heroes, we are laudably, we are quite justifiably paying tribute mainly to the people on the front line who are risking their lives. No scientist is risking their life at the moment. So whilst they might be doing great work, and especially for the discovery of vaccine, hugely needed work, they're not putting their lives at risk. And I think one has to always pay tribute to that and consider that. And it might be that young people, seeing people being that brave and that selfless, want to have them as role models, but it would be more the characters that they want to be like. It would be more the sort of person that they'd want to be rather than the sort of job they'd want to have. In terms of the science, it might be that they would inspire if they see the excitement of the Oxford scientists, for example, as they're developing a vaccine, and fingers crossed and hoping that by September there may be favourable results of the trials. It may be that inspires some young people to think, God, I'd like to get in on that kind of excitement. I think nonetheless what it does show is how science is central to our lives, which has always been one of the mantras of the public understanding of science, and I think that can be no bad thing.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other consequences, obviously, of the pandemic has been the sort of the lockdowns, and the fact that, you know, people are staying at home and are engaging online, whether it's on Zoom meetings or just, you know, watching more Netflix or probably internet gaming. I know that you have sort of, you know, studied the sort of the potential impact of that kind of behavior, because obviously there's been a massive uptick in that sort of thing. Are there things that we should be, potentially concerned about, particularly in a post-pandemic world?
I think there's many things, and I'm just trying to think of how I can be concise in my summary of some of the concerns. Yeah. I think the first is just rehearsing, interacting with other people. Obviously, very small children will be with their families, and that's fine, but they won't necessarily be with other kids. And it's vital that you rehearse empathy and interpersonal skills, otherwise you won't be very good at it. So things like eye contact, physical touch, very important, body language, voice tone, those things aren't necessarily well rehearsed from a screen. And I think if one has a prolonged period of time with young people not rehearsing communication skills, then they'll have to play a big catch up when they're finally unable to do so. I think one of the hugest problems for all generations is not physically touching. Touch is one of the most basic human needs. It's the most basic form of communication. And one has parallels drawn with the Second World War. Yes, in the Second World War, you could still all go to the pub and hug each other and stay close. And I think that this very basic need, the fact that we are getting that prescribed, is going to have quite long-term consequences on it. I'd like to think that perhaps a kind of unfettered diet of screens, whether it's video games and social media, might make people appreciate the outdoors and 3 dimensions more, and might, dare I say it, might they get bored with the screens. That would be fantastic if there's suddenly this novel new way of living, where you can actually stimulate 5 senses and be outside and run in 3 dimensions. That would actually be a good aspect of it. By the same token, it might be people become almost recluses, are sort of agoraphobic, that you get so used to communicating this way that you lose all confidence in going out. And horror, having a real-time conversation with someone face to face, heavens, imagine that. So it could go many ways, and I think all those possibilities will vary from individual to individual, but it could be that we are conducting the biggest uncontrolled and unplanned experiment ever in terms of the impact of screen technology on how various generations are thinking and feeling.
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned it already about the fact that politicians are sort of using the mantra of following the science, etc. I'm just wondering, you're in the upper house. The pandemic. I was just wondering, what is the impact you think the pandemic is actually having on politicians' attitudes towards science?
Politicians' attitudes to science, I think they're finding they need it way more than at any other time. But as someone said, what would be better in a way would be not to mix the two, to have meetings and briefings given just by the scientists or given by the politicians, and not to muddy it. And I think by politicians inviting scientists in compromises the scientists, because inevitably they're going to find it hard to be dispassionate and separate from somehow the science policies and the people that they're on committees with. And there's a lot of debate, or there has been a lot of debate on this very issue. So I think an interesting question is not just how much are politicians relying on scientists, but how much are scientists are influenced by politicians. And this has been a long societal issue of how free can science be, and one only has to look at the 20th century to see how science was hijacked by various regimes and politics to prove points that they wanted to prove. And I think there's no easy answer to that, but I think politicians, perhaps more than usual, are now realizing that they have to give some platform to scientists, or they have to entertain the science. But I'd say I think I echo Brian Cox. It's really a misunderstanding to talk about the science as though it's a monolith that everyone buys into, that it's a commodity and you follow it. It doesn't work like that in any way.
The other thing, of course, also is that we've seen, one of the reactions of the politicians or governments is to actually throw quite a lot of money at looking for sort of diagnostics around COVID, or looking for treatments or for vaccines. So there's literally billions of dollars are being pushed towards that. Are you concerned that means that other parts of the sort of scientific system are going to lose out?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It has crossed my mind, given my work on neurodegeneration, which until the COVID crisis, I could say was one of the biggest biomedical crises facing humanity. Now, of course, it's been upstaged by the COVID crisis. But what I'm hoping is with COVID, the path ahead is in a sense clearer. Get a vaccine, get a good antibody test, and get a treatment for this virus. Now, those things conceptually are not difficult. Yeah, obviously, technically they are, scientifically they're very challenging, but the path is a very straightforward one as to what's needed and what the result should look like. With neurodegeneration, it's much harder because I have to persuade people as to what the underlying cause is in the first place. Whereas with COVID, everyone knows what the cause is. It's this virus and they know they need to target it, and that's the end of it. So in a sense, I'm hoping that they'll get there within the next year or so. And once that is done, then we can turn ourselves again to the longer term problems such as Alzheimer's. Already it is featuring in terms of the problems with care homes, of course, and looking after dementing patients. So I don't think anyone thinks that the issue with Alzheimer's is going away. And none of my investors have said, oh, we were going to invest in you, but we're not now because we're going to invest in COVID. No one has said that. But I think everyone's playing a waiting game, as am I myself. We're on furlough, we're sitting back. And of course, we need the vaccine. We need a treatment that works. We need the testing to work, because only then can I do my job properly. Only when that happens can I get back to work, and only then can I get back to Culham. So I'm quite comfortable with everyone talking about COVID with masses of money going into that, because until that is resolved, the world won't function. And so therefore that has to get sorted. So I don't resent a single penny going to the COVID work. And I don't think in any way it would rival work money coming to us. So
So sort of looking through the sort of various lenses, I mean, what do you think the sort of the key lesson we've learned, or we should learn from this whole sort of, pandemic episode?
I think really, and it's so easy to be wise in retrospect. We really should be looking at other countries and see what has worked and what hadn't worked. And I applaud New Zealand, and I know that's a small island, and a small population, but they've had 3 deaths or 10 deaths or something. Similarly, South Korea, which is bigger and everyone is pointing to. So surely it'd be quite straightforward to really study what has gone before and other countries. And I feel that perhaps we didn't do that sufficiently. So we didn't go in hard and early as those countries did. And the fact that the two things they've got in common, they went in hard and early. And I think perhaps had we done that, then things might have been different. But I stress, what am I? I just say I'm a neuroscientist. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not an expert in disease control. But it strikes me as an ordinary citizen of the country that a very simple strategy would be to see what's working and what is not working in other places.
Okay, and going forward, I mean, in that post-pandemic world, what do you think you will be doing differently, or which behaviors have you adopted now do you think that you're likely to be sustained?
A very easy one to answer immediately is Zoom meetings, because even though I do prefer face-to-face meetings, obviously, in the old days, pre-COVID, I would have teleconferences where you would just be on the phone and you could hear a slate tapping in the background. They might be secretly typing. Or people that weren't actually speaking at the time would be doodling or doing something else. Whereas now with Zoom meetings, that's impossible. You can see them all the time. So, and also the quality of sound's better. So whilst I'll never again do Zoom parties, which I think is the invention of hell, Zoom meetings and webinars I'm finding as a skill that I've acquired and part of my work in practice, something I'll do a lot more. I think also people say looking at working from home practices and so on, I think it's made me really appreciate working with other people and working. If you're a scientist, you do want to work as a team, and however good the technology, to be able to just shout, hey, come and have a look at this, come and see this, oh, I've just had an idea. Somehow that doesn't work in Zoom. So I will still, I hope, be having as many face-to-face meetings as possible once the world is normal again.
Yeah, so I guess it's those sort of random interactions that sometimes can generate
Exactly. And it's brainstorming. It's sitting in a group and looking at data together, which I know you can do on Zoom, but somehow it's more stilted, as are Zoom parties compared to real parties.
Yeah. It's always much difficult if you haven't got an audience.
Indeed.
which is what we're attempting to do here. So, Susan, thanks very much
My
for
pleasure, Mike.
for taking the time to talk to us today. This is very interesting, and good luck with all the efforts you're doing. And again, I'm sure that the audience will be inspired by some of your comments, and will be interested in also the thoughts around the politicians and that public understanding of science.
Yeah, surely.
Because that's important. So if after listening to this broadcast, you've got either questions for me or for Susan, please click the link that's at the end of the video, and we'd love to have your feedback. It's very, very useful for us, because it allows us to shape these broadcasts to make them as useful as possible. And if you'd like to sort of tune into other episodes, if you follow in our LinkedIn page, we'll be posting updates on forthcoming episodes. So in closing, again, I'd like to thank Susan for joining us. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in. This is, we appreciate it. And I'd also, as we sort of mentioned in the interview, we'd like to pay tribute to all those people in the healthcare system, the frontline workers who are making a big effort to tackle this pandemic. We're all very, very grateful for those efforts. So on behalf of me, DRG, Clarivate, and everybody, thank you very much to those. Until next time, stay safe, stay healthy. I'm Mike Ward, and I'll see you in the next episode.